my pleasure to introduce Anna Carter Florence. Anna is the author of Preaching as Testimony. She holds degrees from Yale University and Princeton Theological Seminary. Much of her work as a scholar and a teacher have been focused on two of many great passions, youth and poetics. Anna served as a pastor at Westminster Presbyterian Church right here in Minneapolis for 5 years. She now lives in Decatur, Georgia, where she teaches at Columbia Theological Seminary. When not teaching there or traveling the country, lecturing and preaching, you can find Anna often shuttling her boys back and forth between lacrosse and basketball practices and games, often knitting in the stands while watching them play. At Columbia Seminary, Anna holds the Peter Marshal Chair in Homiletics, and very much like the preacher for whom this chair is named, Anna combines a passion for the redemptive and life-giving power of the gospel with a keen and creative respect for the biblical witness. Please join me in welcoming Anna Carter Florence.
All right, before I start, I want to say something about my footwear. I broke my ankle earlier this summer, and I have, with great pride, progressed out of the cast and the walking cast into really spiffy new sneakers. So I want to show you what I can do. Ready? Because this has taken a lot of work. Okay. I feel like that was sort of important to do because somebody yesterday said, "Oh, I just thought that was part of your fashion statement." And I thought, are you kidding me? So, all right. I've been spending a lot of time reading Mark lately. Do you find that you have a favorite gospel that you return to over and over? For me, it's Mark. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's the great teacher I had in seminary who helped me read it in Greek for the first time, or the students I had a year ago whose performance of the entire gospel helped me hear it for the first time. Or maybe it's just the fact that it's short, only 16 chapters. I like an author who knows how to edit. Why say it in 28 chapters or 24 or 21, Matthew, Luke, and John, if you can say it in 16? Mark is the man, and as I tell my students, it is a lot harder to write a short sermon than a long one. Mark is also a preacher. Fred Craddock said that. You want to improve your preaching, read Mark, because he'll shape the way you use language. At Columbia Seminary, where I teach, the first preaching texts we assign our students to work on are from Mark, because we've learned when students are just starting out and looking for role models, you want to point them toward preachers that are concise. You don't want them spending a lot of time yet in Matthew or Luke or, God help you, John, because if you do, you have to be ready to explain to your seminarian the difference between Jesus, I am speeches, your seminarians, I am speeches, Jesus' birth narrative, your seminarian's birth narrative, Jesus' genealogy, your seminarian's genealogy, on and on. Matthew, Luke, and John are brilliant and inspired, but they are, and great scripture, but they are not great preaching role models for beginners. Mountain climbers don't start with Everest, you know? But you are safe with Mark. Mark is brilliant at any stage of a preacher's life, and I want him to be my students' first preaching role model. So I can say to them, listen, y'all, if you can say it in 4 pages, you don't need to say it in 8. Pare down to what's essential immediately. Yeah, which is important also to be able to say. So I've been spending a lot of time in Mark this year, and not just, as it turns out, with preachers. I've been reading with groups of lay people also around the country, and chapter 5, as a matter of fact. I chose it because I thought it would make an interesting Bible study for a weekend gathering. I thought this is a chapter I read with my students every year, so obviously I'm reasonably prepared. I'm up on the scholarship. I'm ready for whatever someone might throw at me. After 12 years of seminarians reading this text, surely there isn't anything left that's going to surprise me, right? Wrong. So wrong. Maybe the only way to really hear Mark the preacher is to give up your own image of yourself, the preacher. Okay, what I'm going to say here is not something I could ever present at SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, with people who spend their professional lives reading and studying Mark. But we aren't a biblical society. We're a group of preachers, which is already weird enough, and which I assume gives me some leeway to be as peculiar as everyone out there already assumes that we are. You know that, right? There is not anything stranger than a room full of preachers who aren't preaching. We aren't just a celebration, we're our own little circus. So try to take off your really literal scholarly, not that scholars are literal, try to put on some liminal headphones and roll with me and think wide, okay? One reason I like reading the Bible with lay people is that they ask a lot of questions that you and I would never ask. Because you and I think we're already supposed to know the answer. Lay people don't have that pressure on them. So you can loosen them up, which is fairly easy to do if you're only visiting for a few days, as I usually am. They know they aren't stuck with me. The room gets hopping fairly quickly. And here is the question I have heard most about Mark 5 this year from lay people. How come some people get to tell about Jesus and others don't? Now, just so you know, my students and I have never asked that question. Why? Because we already know the theory that explains it. The messianic secret, right? You remember that? The theory we learned in seminary in New Testament classes, the one a German scholar named William Reda proposed over 100 years ago. It explains one theory why in Mark's gospel, Jesus is always ordering people not to tell what they know about him. And the theory is that Mark wants to keep Jesus' true identity a secret until the very end. No one will know until he dies and is raised that he was the Messiah. Because he's not the kind of Messiah everyone was expecting, right? He will not fight and win for us. He will suffer and die for us, which doesn't look very messianic, the cross part 2, on the face of things, but actually it is if you're in on the secret. So, Mark keeps delaying the fullness of who Jesus is until the very end, when we'll be able to put the pieces together. That's the theory, right? Messianic secret. So, when these lay people in these groups I've been reading with said, how come some people get to talk about Jesus and others don't? I naturally replied, well, that's the messianic secret. It's this theory about the Gospel of Mark, and I explained it. Lay people are very patient with us. They listened politely, and they said, okay, we get the theory. Don't tell the secret until the end of the gospel. So, why aren't the characters in the 5th chapter of Mark following the rule? What do you mean? I asked. Well, they said there's nothing secret in the 5th chapter of Mark. Everybody hears about Jesus, and a lot of people are talking about him. Well, maybe we should go back to chapter 1. I said, you see, there's a story in chapter 1 about Jesus healing a leper and strictly ordering the leper not to tell anyone. That's the messianic secret. Yeah, they said, but look, the leper goes out and blabs anyway. Huh, I said. And what about the demons and the unclean spirits, they asked. Mark says they know him. Jesus won't let them talk, but they know him, and it's not the end of the story yet. Good point, I said. And what about chapter 5, they asked. Why does the Gerasene demoniac get to tell what he knows about Jesus? And Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, whose little daughter was raised, doesn't. How come some characters get to talk and others don't? And suddenly it hit me. These lay people were absolutely right. Maybe we have been asking the wrong question. Maybe the messianic secret isn't about what we're supposed to tell or when we're supposed to tell it. Maybe it's about who gets to tell. And you know who gets to tell about Jesus in chapter 5? Crazy people and 12-year-old girls. And a woman who hemorrhages her whole truth in front of God and everybody. I want you to listen now. We're going to hear Mark 5 in its entirety, and I have some people who are going to help. So be encouraging of them, not too reverent.
They came to the other side of the lake, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. The man lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When the man saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice,
"What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, do not torment me."
For Jesus had said to him,
"Come out of the man, you unclean spirit!"
Then Jesus asked him,
"What is your name?"
The man replied,
"My name is Legion, for we are many."
He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him. So Jesus gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned in the lake. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then Jesus came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him, but Jesus refused and said to him,
"Go home to your friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you."
And the man went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered round him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly.
"My little daughter, she's at the point of death. Come and just lay your hands upon her so that she might be well and live."
So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in upon him.
Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much from under many physicians and had spent all that she had, but she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came upon him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said,
"If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well."
Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said,
"Who touched my clothes?"
And his disciples said to him,
"Jesus, you see this crowd pressing in on you? How can you say who touched me?"
Jesus looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her,
"Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, healed of your disease."
While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say,
"Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?"
but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue,
"Do not fear, only believe."
He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them,
"Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping."
and they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her,
"Talitha kum,"
which means,
"Little girl, get up."
and immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat.
The word of the Lord. Here's what I've learned this year. When I'm reading the text with lay people and I'm not looking for a sermon, I actually hear it differently. I'm not trying out focus and function statements to find something, anything that fits. I'm not worried about what I'm going to say in exactly 33 hours, not that I'm counting. I don't have any of that pressure at all. I can just listen to Mark the preacher, and if the text is awkward, well, then it's awkward. And I can ask questions. And if I don't like the answers, I can keep asking them, because it's not my job to explain anything. I'm just reading. And that lets me get interested in details that I might have rushed past if I had a preaching deadline. In Mark 5, those lay people asked me, why is the Gerasene demoniac empowered to tell what he knows about Jesus, and Jairus isn't? How come some characters get to talk and others don't? I've been reading this text with preachers for years, and not one of us has ever asked that question. Why is that? I don't think it's because we weren't smart enough, or schooled enough, or diligent enough, although I admit for my 8 a.m. classes, awake enough might be a problem. I think we never asked that question because we were preparing to be the ones who do get to speak about Jesus, and it was not in our best interests to ask it. It's a funny thing. The church gives preachers the power to speak, but in Scripture, it's different. In Scripture, the one who has the power to speak is not always the leader of the synagogue. It's often the marginal person, the crazy person, the one you are going out of your way to distance yourself from, because doesn't the church have enough problems already? I mean, we are just trying to get a hearing in this culture that grants us so little power and authority to begin with. We need all the power to speak, all the homiletical superpowers we can get. Why should we invite a reading of Mark 5 that disrupts what little power we have left? I think we invite those readings precisely because they are dangerous. We don't preach a gospel of self-preservation, not even our own. And we don't preach a gospel of secrets. That's a pretty dangerous road to go down these days. The road where some of us are in on a secret and others aren't. The road where those with superior knowledge have authority while the others don't. That's a fearsome road. Ask your Roman Catholic friends about the relationship between secrets and power in their church. It has ruptured their authority. And if our speech as preachers becomes primarily about preserving our own power to speak because of superior knowledge or secret knowledge, we're lost. And the church with us. But take heart. In the chapter 5 of Mark, new role models await you. They aren't exactly homiletical superheroes. Mark inverts things mostly. But they would be great action figures, especially if they came with cool accessories like cliff-jumping pigs. So, first, we have the Gerasene demoniac. Or maybe I should say the man formerly known as the Gerasene demoniac, since Jesus cures him. He didn't ask for Jesus to do it. He was perfectly content in his own graveyard, listening to his own voices, chunking away at his chains. Who needs to be clothed and in your right mind when no one can subdue you? Must have been a great PR opportunity on Jesus' part. Cast the demons out of the crazy guy in the graveyard, you'll make a name for yourself. People are going to notice that something is different in the neighborhood. Especially if you do that thing with the swine at the end. Nice touch. You're going to make the evening news. The problem is that people don't always like to see a change in the neighborhood. You mean you're taking away my demoniac? What are we going to show the tourists now? I mean, this is what we're known for in Gerasene country, our haunted graveyard and our shackled lunatic. This you thought was necessary to take away a neighborhood fixture, our favorite scapegoat? Maybe you should leave now before you ruin any more real estate or drown any more herds. And Mark says they begged Jesus to leave the neighborhood. If Jesus wasn't welcome in their village, the man formerly known as the demoniac obviously sensed that he wasn't either. So he begged Jesus to be allowed to come along. And Jesus refused. Here's what he said. Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you. You know, there are several strange things about that. One is Jesus' assumption that the man has a home and friends, when the villagers have clearly indicated that he doesn't. Another is that the man has a story to tell that people will, 1, want to hear, 2, believe. I doubt that. This is not mission territory that strikes me as particularly hospitable for a new church plant. But Jesus does not care about whether something is fertile suburban ground or not. His command is simple: go home, tell your friends, tell them what the Lord did for you before you ever knew to ask. Tell them that he showed you mercy before you ever knew what it was. That's what you know. That's what you saw. So just tell them, maybe like this. Once I lived in a tomb and was possessed by demons. Now I live in freedom and am possessed by grace. It's a good story, and it's yours. So tell it. Second action figure. The 12-year-old girl. Jairus' daughter. No name of her own, which is a familiar story, irritating, also intriguing if you think about it. We have all in this room been 12 years old. We remember. You are on the cusp of something then. You are not really a child, not really an adult, betwixt and between, but definitely on the verge of life. You can feel it, which is thrilling and terrifying. So a 12-year-old girl on her deathbed is heartbreaking. Her father, Jairus, must have thought Jesus could heal her. At least he hoped he could. He was desperate enough to throw himself at Jesus' feet, which is something I bet he'd never done before to anyone. How many times a week do you throw yourself at someone's feet? This man was a leader of the synagogue. He was an important person. He had credibility in the community. At least he did have it before he made that big public scene. And here's what Jairus said. My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Notice, he wants both things for her. To be made well and to live. They don't always go together, you know. Plenty of people are made well and never live at all, and vice versa. But this is a father who wants a life for his child, a future she can walk into herself healed, or maybe we should say, clothed and in her right mind. Come lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. This is a beautiful portrait of a parent. And Jesus must have thought so too, because he went with him. There's an interruption on the way to the house. We'll get to that in a minute. Suffice it to say, the interruption takes time, too much time, as far as the girl is concerned. She dies before they reach the house. And we know because some people came to bring Jairus the news. Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? And Jesus quickly turns to Jairus and says, do not fear, only believe. Which is a bit cryptic. Do not fear what? That she's dead? Do not, or only believe what? That I can raise her? Up to this point in Jesus' ministry in Mark, he's only conducted healings and exorcisms. No one has asked him to resurrect the dead. In fact, Jairus never asked him to do it either. But that's the only option now. If his daughter is going to be part of this world, that's a lot to believe. That's a lot to hope for. Too much. If you know what the rest of us know, the dead stuff stays dead. They get to the house, and the mourners are already there. Nothing kicks in as quickly as the machinery of death. At the church, it's something that we are often good at. And with Tom's book, I hope better. 10 minutes after you get the call, I'm sure you've seen this, that someone has died. The network is already functioning. People are making calls. Others are bringing food. Others are going to the airport to pick up arrivals. Others are planning a reception that's going to be after the funeral. The community knows what to do when death happens. Everybody plays their part. And for a leader of the synagogue, there are a lot of parts. My students think that Jesus flunks Pastoral Care 101 at this point. He turns to the mourners and says, why do you make a commotion and weep? The girl is not dead, but sleeping. I think he's lucky they only laughed at him. I would have had to be restrained. You don't joke about death. You don't make sick jokes in the presence of a stricken father and mother who are undoubtedly in shock. Well, but Jesus isn't joking. He's giving them something to remember later if they want to. We'll get back to that. Meanwhile, he puts all the laughing mourners outside, like the dog, and takes just a select group into the house. The girl's parents and 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. I used to think Jesus always chose Peter, James, and John because they were the most promising disciples. Now I wonder if it was because they needed extra help in order to keep up with the class. I don't know. Notice that when they go into where the girl is, they are leaving public space, entering private space, no witnesses, except the 6 people in that room, and outside, a very confused crowd that is going to want some information about what is going on. Tell your youth group back home that the first person Jesus ever resurrected was a 12-year-old girl. This is a confirmation text if there ever was one. Look what he does. No dramatic hand-waving and grand pronouncements. Little girl, I say to you, arise. No, he just takes her by the hand. It's even better than what Jairus wanted him to do originally, to lay hands on her. That's a healing action, right? But to take someone by the hand is a come with me action. Come on, let's go. And the words, when he says them, as Mark writes them, are in Aramaic, which is so unusual for Mark. He only lets Jesus speak in his mother tongue very occasionally, on the cross, for example. Here it strikes me as if Mark wanted to preserve the intimacy. Talitha cum. Come on, little girl, get up. Some translators think it means, get up, little lamb, which is so beautiful. But you have to admit, a little strange for a resurrection formula. As if she wasn't really dead, but sleeping. Of course, she gets up immediately, begins to walk around. 12-year-old girls can move. We know that. And Jesus tells the adults who are standing around, amazed, slack-mouthed, that they are not allowed to speak to anyone about this. He strictly orders them, in fact. Instead, he suggests that they give her something to eat. 12-year-old girls are hungry when they wake up. So now we're back to our original question. Why does the Gerasene demoniac get to tell what he knows about Jesus and Jairus doesn't? These men actually have more in common than we might think. They each have a great story to tell. They are both public figures in their separate villages. Everyone knows that the Gerasene man used to be crazy possessed. They all saw it. Likewise, everyone knows that Jairus' daughter used to be so sick she almost died, and maybe did. They all saw that too. 2 unbelievable stories of recovery in every sense of the word. But Jesus only allows the totally marginal man with no reputation to tell what the Lord has done for him. Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, the man with a perfectly respectable reputation, is ordered to say nothing. Why? Well, maybe it's an issue of authority. If your authority comes from who you are, rather than what you know about Jesus, that's a dangerous situation. You're going to be tempted to change the subject to yourself. Yes, that's exactly what happened. I begged Jesus to come and lay hands on my daughter, and he did. In fact, he brought her back from the dead. I was worried, but he told me, don't be afraid, Jairus, only believe. And obviously I did, because here she is, good as new. And before you know it, Jairus has his own agent, his own book contract, his own regular spot on Fox News, his own 10,000-member synagogue, because we all want to be like Jairus. We all want to read his bestseller, The Prayer of Jairus. He's the subject, right? He's the subject. And you can be too, if you do the right things. But if Jairus doesn't get to speak, what happens? Well, his daughter's going to go to the kitchen, get something to eat. Pretty soon she'll head outside to play where the crowd is still waiting. Hey, everybody, she'll say, what's up? And the mourners who laughed will now be hysterical. They will be totally freaking out because what is going on here? This daughter of Jairus is dead and is alive again. Jesus, what did you do? What should we do? Celebrate, kill a fatted calf, run for cover? What do we do? If Jairus doesn't get to speak, you know what happens? His daughter gets to tell her story. She'll tell it with her body, simply by being alive and well. And as she lives, which is all her father ever asked for her in the first place, she may find words to say a few things. She might say, all I know is I heard Jesus' voice calling me, and I felt his hand pulling me up and out of bed, so I got up and walked and ate, and here I am. Maybe not a lot of dense theological commentary in those words, in the testimony of a 12-year-old girl, but it is richer than any sermon you or I could ever preach. Because it's her life. And what she knows is this: Jesus called her, Jesus took her by the hand, Jesus pulled her up. That's all any of us want, isn't it? To be that loved, to be that important, that wanted. If every 12-year-old girl could preach that sermon, the world would be a different place. So let her preach it. Let her preach what she knows, even if she never uses words. That's your second action figure, y'all. Jairus' daughter, the girl who lived. And last but not least, third, the woman who interrupted. The woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, had endured much under many physicians. Look at those verbs. You know what it's like, don't you? Had endured much, spent all that she had, was no better, rather grew worse. I don't know how you can be worse than hemorrhaging, but she was. Jairus threw himself at Jesus' feet. This woman couldn't even do that. She came up behind him just to touch a piece of his robe. Not to trouble him, not to beg him for anything, just to touch him, because when you're that down, maybe you don't even want to talk to anyone. You just want to slip in and slip out. Hope that whatever jolt you get will be enough to make you well. No one can survive when they're hemorrhaging blood, or hope, or dreams, or energy, or even the faith that what you do matters to anyone at all. I want to ask you for an audience. Jesus, I don't even know what I would ask, but if I touch your clothes, I'll be made well, and maybe I'll remember how to live too. Two immediatelys right there. One, her hemorrhage, it stopped. Two, Jesus, aware that power had gone forth from him. Like she plugged into him. Zzzt, very strange word choice. Power had gone forth from him, cheerfully guaranteed to wreck whatever Christology you hold most dear. No one gets away from this passage without serious dents in their theological body, I can tell you that. There's a bit with the disciples grumbling at Jesus for asking the crowd who touched him, and then this. The woman knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before Jesus, and told him the whole truth. What's the difference between the truth and the whole truth? That's what adolescents are learning, right? Where were you last night? The truth was, I was with Sam at his house. The whole truth is, I was at Sam with his house and 30 other people and 3 kegs of beer and no parents, and the cops came by. Jesus asked a question. Who touched me? And the woman answered it. If she had told him the truth, what would she have said? I did. That's the truth. But the whole truth, that's something else. That leads you into very deep water, very raw confession. Oh Lord, I am a woman who has been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. I have suffered much under many physicians. I've spent all that I had. I am no better and rather grew worse. And I said to myself, I heard about you. I said to myself, if I but touch his clothes, I'll be made well. So I came up behind you in the crowd and I touched your clothes. And immediately I felt in my body that I was healed of my disease. And I'm so sorry that I did this without your permission, making you unclean and breaking the law. Please forgive me. But I have been suffering from hemorrhages for so long. I don't even remember who I used to be. And what does he say to her? Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed of your disease. 3 things he gives her: a charge, a benediction, and a notice to the community. She's yours now. She's a daughter of Israel. She belongs here. Treat her like family. I don't think the hemorrhaging woman makes the most appealing and appropriate homiletical role model for Sunday morning or whenever it is that you worship, but she is definitely your action figure before you step into the pulpit. Before you ever say a word, you have to tell God the whole truth about yourself. Not just the truth, the whole truth. The places you are losing blood and strength and hope for the world. The places you have tried to fix yourself and just can't, no matter how much you spend. The fact that you're so tired you can't even beg for what you want. You just know that if you touch him with one finger, it might be enough if you reach through the crowd, and there's always a crowd. So there you have it. No homiletical superheroes with superior knowledge and power to speak, just some great preacher action figures for the seriously deranged, courtesy of the 5th chapter of Mark, where the primary question isn't what we say about Jesus, whether it coheres with a theory or a doctrine or some secret knowledge about Jesus' true identity. It isn't what we say or when, it's who gets to say it. Who is allowed to speak? And in Mark, his take on that, this chapter, seems to say, you might not have to wait until the end of the story to open your mouth. You can speak from right smack in the middle of your own life, exactly where you are. Because the only authority comes from what you have seen and believe about Jesus. It won't come from your ordination. It won't come from superior or secret knowledge. It will come from where you meet Jesus in this text and in this life every week over and over again. And that is such good news for preachers, because it keeps us from thinking that our power to speak has more to do with us than the God we point to. I think the action figures actually have a logical progression to them. So if you want a way to organize them, you could try this. Your first action figure, I should have brought some, old Barbies and Kens. The first one, the hemorrhaging preacher. That one's for you alone, without the congregation. It's for when you're ready to fall down and tell Jesus the whole truth about yourself. Do it before you preach. Do it while you write and prepare. You can pull this action figure out every week if you have to, whatever it takes to tell the congregation the whole truth about God. Because you can't tell anyone the whole truth about God until you've told God the whole truth about you. Second one, action figure number 2. The crazy possessed preacher. This is probably your standard issue action figure for daily wear because it is an apt portrayal of the preacher's authority. What, you thought you were a leader of the synagogue? You thought you had a respectable reputation in this community, as if, get over yourself. You are the person others see as clothed and not in your right mind. And that's why Jesus chose you. He knew nobody would believe you because of you. They would only believe you because it's a really good story. So tell it. This is what the Lord did for us before we ever knew to ask. This is the mercy of God, that we call one another friend and lay down our lives. And then action figure number 3, the 12-year-old girl. This is the action figure you give away to members of your congregation. And you will know who they are. The ones who used to be dead and are alive again. The ones we gave up on, but who somehow heard Jesus' voice. The ones who might be content to stay quiet because there are others who would be happy to tell the story for them. Their parents. Jairus. No. You tell Jairus this is not his story to tell. Jesus didn't raise that girl because she is the child of Jairus. Jesus raised that girl because she is a child of God. He raised her that she might be made well and live, and her story, it's going to unfold in the living. So give her that action figure and encourage her to tell what she wants in her own way. You know, I think it would make a great project for the youth group or the men's breakfast or the women's sewing circle or whatever to get some action figures at some garage sale and outfit them with handcrafted items, whatever anyone in the congregation wants to contribute. It would be a way for the congregation to come in on the conversation about our community's homiletic. What does our superhero action preacher need week after week to proclaim the gospel? What do we need as listeners? You could have a lot of fun with that. You could lighten up. You could play around. We get so serious. And you can't be too serious, which is nice, with crazy possessed preacher and his faithful sidekicks, the swineherds. And what do swineherds wear anyway? How would you knit a tiny version of that? Ask your people to help you with that one, and let me know.
Anna, you always help us to hear the text so much more closely, better than we would otherwise. But this time you've also given us a name for next year's gathering, no longer the celebration of biblical preaching, but instead the circus of biblical preaching. That's going to be a hard one to live down.